Ladies and gentlemen, and for all those who identify otherwise, for all those who don't know me, I am Elliot Steen, the chairman for the Bristol University Conservative Association. Essentially, it's been my pleasure to organise this event, being a part of BUCA, and I have to make a few thanks to people. Firstly, Jack Ross, part of 20.UK, Darren Grimes himself, all of you for being here, and also our lovely cameraman. Before we start, I think it's really good to clap them. So for all of you who don't know who Darren Grimes is, I definitely say you're in the minority. So Darren, after seeing the light when he was a Liberal Democrat campaigner when he was younger, is now a prominent supporter and proponent of Brexit and Conservative ideas, and now is the director of Reasoned. So without further ado, in the heart of Bristol, I'd like to introduce Darren Grimes. Thank you very much.
Fortunately, my voice is still with us, but it might go during proceedings, so if it does, I do profusely apologise. I did make it, though, a prerequisite of my attendant that there weren't any letters that could fall off, so I'm not about to do a Theresa May. And I'm also absolutely delighted, as you might be able to tell, because Newcastle United is no longer owned by Mike Ashley, so happy days! But I thought, first of all, for those that might not be aware of this, I imagine there are many, and I'd give you a little sort of insight into my politics and what it was that made me, I guess, political to begin with. I remember my mother telling me the proudest moment of her life, and this will appeal to younger people because there's a fat bloody chance of you getting on the housing ladder, put it that way, where she said it was the proudest moment of my life was when I bought my council house. And I remember, I was quite young when she told us that. And I remember it sticking because I also recognised a sort of change in behaviour from that one individual act, from that purchase, where all of a sudden the house had renovations to it. She, you know, when something is your own, you naturally do want to take care of it, to nurture it, to do all of these other things. And it wasn't until I watched, and you'll not believe this actually, it wasn't until I watched a BBC documentary called Tory, which is I recommend it to everyone actually, from 2007. And it was all about the Thatcher revolution. And it wasn't until I watched this documentary that I realised that these ideas, the idea of buying a council house, of not being beholden to the state, was an inherently conservative idea, the idea of a property-owning democracy and all of these other things. I'll get on to where I think the Conservative Party is going wrong on that front at the moment, because I'm not sure, I don't know how many people among you, how many of you lot would identify as being capitalists. I certainly would, but raise your hand if you would happily self-identify, that watchword of the moment, as a capitalist. Well, that's actually quite healthy. Well done, you lot. Because I'm not sure why anyone would believe in capitalism if you don't own any capital. And that's what's happening as far as the housing crisis is concerned at the moment. That's why I think there's a sort of dereliction of duty among proponents of conservatism at the moment. And so from that point, I thought, well, you know, I believe in people being able to buy property, not being beholden to the state, or welfare and all of these other things. I must be a liberal. So I joined the Liberal Democrats, and it was around about the time of the same-sex marriage debate, so you're talking 2012, 2013. And I thought, right, well, I believe in all of these things, therefore I must be a liberal. I'm a Liberal Democrat. As it happens, the Liberal Democrats are no longer democratic or liberal, so that was a bit of a mistake. I realised I'd made a horrible mistake at around about 2015, 2016, and I joined the Conservative Party. Now, as you might know, I have since then left that party as well. So loyalty apparently isn't one of my strong suits. But the problem for me, I think, is that politics, a lot of people, one thing I hear more than anything else is that politics doesn't speak to people like me. Politics isn't for people like me. And I used to think that as well at one point. I used to think be one of those people. My mother actually watched Channel 4 News when I was a kid. It's amazing that I'm not somewhere to the left of Chairman Mao. And I used to watch it, and I used to think, that's not for people like us. You know, politics is something that happens in Westminster, it's not for people like us. But my problem with politics at the moment is that a lot of people feel really disenfranchised and really disillusioned. Even, I think the Brexit vote exposed that sort of on steroids. And it's one thing I've noticed, and that's why I'm really worried about the direction of this Conservative Party. I think it is utterly rudderless. I think it is sorely lacking in principle, in guiding principle. I think they're very important. I've referenced Mrs. T earlier. I think Margaret Thatcher, many of you might disagree vehemently with some of the things that she perhaps stood for. But my God, one thing you can't say about her is that she didn't know what she was about. That woman had a very clear mission. That woman had a very clear philosophy and a guiding sort of viewpoint to get her through things. And I feel that that's what's missing from politics at the moment. And basically the Tory party's pitch now is, well, we're not as bad as Labour. And if you ask me, it's not a good enough USP, frankly. It's a, if you don't mind us swearing, I think it's a bloody shocking one, and it's an abomination. I think Boris Johnson needs to get his act together as soon as possible. One thing Elliot told me actually was that the student union had been playing silly buggers and only approved this event yesterday. And that got us thinking about, someone just asked me if I'm controversial as well. And that's an interesting question actually, are you controversial? Not as controversial as the vast majority of the British people, by the way. The view that's parroted in much of the media, by much of the political class, by, well, social media, I guess, Twitter especially, despite the fact only 20% of the country, by the way, which is sort of a lot as far as global statistics are concerned. We have a disproportionate number of people on Twitter, but still it's only 20% of people in this country are actually on there, and they swing massively to the left. But the views of people on these platforms, the views of people that get to do question time and all the rest of it, the views of people that actually get into Parliament, they are so completely out of step and removed from the views of the vast majority of the public, let me tell you that. So if you think I'm controversial, folks, I suggest that you get out of Bristol and go talk to people out there in the real world. But I guess that got us thinking, the student union question got us thinking about the fact that what I've seen, I don't know if anyone else has seen this from Sussex University today, where Professor Kathleen Stock, who has written a book on the trans debate, has been hounded, and there have been calls by the student union and other groups to actually have her lose her job. Now the student union actually put out a statement today which I was pleasantly surprised by. They said, we cannot and will not tolerate threats to cherished academic freedoms and will take any action necessary to protect the rights of our community. Now that, they of course didn't endorse the views or anything else other than that. Freedom of expression, I think, is under threat like never before actually in this country. You have to go back quite a while before you find a time in which it was as bad as it is today, where someone like me, because perhaps it's my views on everything from believing in capitalism, perhaps it's my view on Brexit, it could be a whole host of things that a student union deems that too controversial to speak to your clever lot here tonight. And I find that really bloody depressing actually. I find it, in a country in which 14 million people voted Tory, the idea, and I hear this time and again, you book a speaker to come, it could be a Tory MP, to come speak at a university, and I think Leeds University in particular, and the booking will be issued, it'll go out there in the public, and like clockwork, the booking has to be cancelled because the venue has pulled out and said, well, you cannot host you here, because of the fact that people have said it's a controversial speaker. Now, that could be the fact that a democratically elected individual, member of the House of Commons, cannot speak at a university, frankly, speaks volumes about the state of free speech in this country today, as far as I'm concerned. And so I was heartened by what Sussex University said, because I really think that the sort of postmodernism, Foucault has never had it so good, in the sense of, I think we are denying truth, we are denying speech, we are denying debate like you wouldn't believe. And that is really dangerous. Even those that vehemently disagree with me, and no doubt there will be some of you among this group today, I would happily give my life, honestly, for the right, for the freedom, for you to be able to articulate your case as to why you think I'm a hateful shite. And I really, really would. And I mean that, I honestly do. Because I think the state of the censorship, the self-censorship even, the amount of people, I've just been to Tory party conference, and I won't go on much longer than this, but I've just been to Tory party conference, and I've just put out a video on Reasons UK, where I asked the party faithful and MPs what they thought about Boris Johnson. What did Boris Johnson stand for? Now, I'm not going to put any of you on the spot, but some of the answers were very frank, and I said, oh, well, would you mind saying that on camera? Would they hell? And that, to me, is really depressing. There is a climate of fear that is brought about, that I think, because of the fact that there is a crisis of an ability to tell the truth. I don't know if he's also the fact that Sir Keir Starmer wouldn't say who does and does not have a cervix, for example. But the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland was asked that very question on GB News this week. Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer refused to answer that question. Who is it that has a cervix, or something along those lines, I paraphrase. And the Prime Minister was not willing to answer the question. He sort of evaded the question. And frankly, I think that says something about the ability to tell the truth in this country. The ability to actually speak in this country. That the Prime Minister of all four constituent parts of this country is unwilling to say who does and doesn't have a sodding cervix. It's absurd, it really, really is. So if there isn't a crisis of free speech in this country today, I don't know what is. But I'm very glad that you did manage to get booked and I could come here and speak to you all, because I think it shouldn't be controversial. One, to speak the truth, despite what postmodernists might say, and much of the left. Apparently I was told by some of you today that one of the most popular stalls at the Fresh Affairs were the Marxist lot, and the Tories were very much sidelined. So I appreciate it's an uphill battle, and it's not going to be easy. And all I would ask of you is, even if it's to call me a hateful shite, tell the truth. Start telling the truth. And that's not Meghan Markle's speak your truth. The truth. Biological sex exists, folks. Women have cervixes. These things shouldn't be, and aren't, in my view, controversial. And I hope that I'll live to see the day when it comes about that truth, speech, and debate are key pillars of British society and life again. So anyone that agrees with that, I say more power to your elbow, and thank you very much for listening to me prattle on for the past however many minutes it's been. Cheers.
Thinking in the long term, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the direction in which British society is going?
Good question. I don't want to sound too much like Peter Hitchens, at risk of doing that, but I'm not wholly optimistic. Poland suggests that many of your generations, I realise it's a mixed audience, but the younger generations are increasingly in favour of censorship and not pro-freedom, actually. So there is a real fight, there is a real challenge. I mean, it's pretty clear that most young people voted for Jeremy Corbyn in the last general election. I am not confident that had Jeremy Corbyn been elected, this country would have been a bastion of free speech and liberty. I think it probably would have been the case that I would have been alongside, I don't know, a whole list of others in some gulag. But what I will say is that I think people are starting to realise the cost of this. People are starting to realise what it actually means to, I guess, lose that freedom and that liberty. Because as far as self-censorship is concerned, and again, to repeat myself, that's the one thing I hear more than anything else is, I wish I could say what you say. I wish, and I've heard this from an MP actually, only this week, who said, thank you, Darren, you say what I wish I could say. And I find that really depressing because it means that the politician that you're voting for, well, is completely leading you on, frankly, right? He's not telling you what he actually believes. And I find it really, really depressing that we live in a society in which people feel that they can't do that. But I think the grassroots organisations, the success of the outfits like the Free Speech Union, for example, which have done sterling work in actually defending people who have said things deemed quote-unquote controversial, when actually back in the day when this country used to actually remember the values of the Enlightenment, is to say, I disagree with you, here's why, X, Y, and Z. Whereas these days, it's I disagree with you, you bastard, I am going to do everything I can to bring you down, to cancel you, to lose you your livelihood, and all these other things. And I'm starting to see a pushback against that, though, like I say, through groups like Free Speech Union, dare I say, through groups like Turning Point, through groups like Reason, and that's positive. I think people are starting to realise the magnitude of the problem that lies before us. So I've sort of half-asked your question, really, but I'm a pessimist at heart, probably, but I'm optimistic that people are starting to realise what's going on. Yeah. Any others? You have to come. It's really awkward. You have to come to the front. Yeah.
So I just wanted to ask. So you mentioned Thatcher.
Uh-huh.
I was wondering if, like, in today's society, you would want someone like Thatcher in power, like her kind of ideology, because obviously, like, she had some quite strong views, which I am personally a fan of. But yeah, I was wondering if you thought it would be appropriate for her to, like, well, imagine she's still alive, be in government today.
One of the things that I heard the most at, again, Tory party conference, one of the questions I asked was, would Mrs T be rolling in her grave? And I think she probably would, to be honest. I thought it was a cheek, frankly, of the Prime Minister to reference Mrs T in his speech. To say that actually she would have raised taxes, I don't think she would have done. This is a woman who believed in the economic teachings of Friedrich von Hayek. This is a woman who quite liked Milton Friedman. This is someone who believed in monetarism and all of these other things, that actually there is a Laffer curve that if you raise taxes too high, you end up raising less revenue, because actually it means that people aren't going out there to work more. It means people aren't starting businesses. It means that young people like yourselves aren't taking risks in lives. You can't get on the housing ladder. And that has economic consequences as far as what jobs you can actually obtain. So there are so many ways, and I think that Mrs T would have said, right, we are in this sort of unfrozen moment. I mean, I realise I'm trying to get into the head of a dead person here, but we are in this unfrozen moment. We have this opportunity of Brexit. Whether you voted for it or not, it is undeniable that that gives policymakers in the United Kingdom a lot more flexibility to shape how British politics looks. I think Mrs Thatcher would have said at that point, we need to make sure that Britain is as competitive and productive as we possibly can, because it's productivity that boosts wages. It's productivity that means that employers can actually make enough money to be able to hire new people. I don't think you go about that by increasing corporation tax, by saying to people, I'll just give you one example. My mother is a teaching assistant, and her pay increase is de facto cancelled by the fact that inflation will be, some predictions say, 4%. And when you're in that position at a time when you've also got the energy crisis that's taking place, I don't think Mrs. Thatcher would have had, she was an environmentalist, but I don't think she would have said, right, what we really need in this country is an arbitrary target of net zero by 2050. Because I think arbitrary targets are really dangerous. I'm all for cleaning up the environment. I'm all for ensuring that we all breathe cleaner air. She was. One of the most infamous speeches she gave was at the United Nations on the conservative case for environmentalism. But I don't think she would have said what we need to do is set an arbitrary target and centrally plan the British economy, which is basically what the statists in power are doing right now. So, frankly, I think we could do with a Mrs. T, because on those fronts, on ensuring that the house building, for example, I think she would have said, right, one of the biggest failures of perhaps her premiership was the fact that we sold off all of this social housing, which is a good thing, I think, because it gives people security, gives people stability. You can actually say, I own this property to pass on to my kids. We didn't replace that housing stock. You know, we sold it off and didn't build like for like. I think that was a mistake. But that's the only thing she got wrong, in my view. And that's a pretty bloody good 11 years. So yes, I think we could do with her back. And let me tell you, she wouldn't have bloody waffled on for the last 4 years since the Brexit. She would have been like, we're out, sling your hoop, France, and all these other things. Mr. Barnier wouldn't have known what hit him. But yes.
You've spoken a fair bit about like the housing crisis and the struggles for young people to get onto the property ladder, and I wonder what changes you'd like to see being made to actually help right that the way that young people are disenfranchised, and kind of how that would change the situation on the whole politically.
Dramatically. Thank you. Really good question. If you build on, it's something like if. One of the defining images, I was at Tory Party Conference 2018, I think, and Siobhan McDonagh, I think I'm getting her name right, she's a, where are you, where have you gone? Oh, there you are. She's a Labour Party, there's a very bright light just directly behind you. She's a Labour Party MP, and I'll never forget it. She was stood next to a screen, and she was going through, she was supposed to be there talking about the housing crisis, and on this screen she had photographs of disused car washes, and she was going through them, and I thought, right, what point is she making? Like, disused, once you've seen one disused car wash, you've seen them all. You can imagine what it looks like, where it's grass everywhere, moss growing off top of this car wash. And she said, do you or do you not think this is classified as greenbelt land? Because when you imagine greenbelt land, you think of rolling vistas. You think of, in my head, you might sing Jerusalem. And all of these other things. And she said, do you think this is classified as greenbelt land? And we all said, no. And she said, it is. Or at least it was. And that, to me, speaks volumes about the problem. I believe in protecting the green belt as far as I don't think the whole of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland should be paved over. But when a disused car wash can be classified as green belt land and we have a severe housing crisis in this country, that's disgusting to me, actually. And that's an abuse of that term, of that definition, of that protection of greenbelt land. So the way, it's something like if you build on 1% of land outside of London, you could pave the way for, quite literally, 1 million homes. And that would be transformative. I don't know how many of you are going to end up in London after graduation and whatever else. It's another question altogether about the sadness and the economic reality of young people feeling the need to move to London because of socio-economic opportunities in the capital. But that would be transformative in the sense that, again, I go back to that point I raised earlier. Why would you be a capitalist if you're unable to ever obtain any capital? I don't know how many of you are shareholders, but I'm assuming not many. I don't know how many of you are property owners, but I'm assuming not many. And you've seen the state of the housing market. That changes everything. And if the Conservative Party doesn't accept that, the Cheshire and Amersham by-election that the Tories lost to the Liberal Democrats, who, by the way, I mentioned earlier that they're no longer Liberal or Democratic. The Lib Dem response to that by-election was to say, well, we will prevent any houses from being built, right? I'm not sure what their idea of liberalism is, but to me that ain't it. And they did that as a cynical attempt to win the election, and to be fair to them, they did. Because people are worried about the Green Belt being built upon. People are worried about areas like Cheshire, which is a beautiful area, it's one of my favourite places. It's hard to believe it's on the tube, but it is. And it would be transformative in the sense of people would suddenly start to believe in the fruits of capitalism. People would start to believe that they can be part of a property-owning democracy. They have a stake in society, like my mother did. And it's depressing to me and rather telling that young people are voting socialist in overwhelming numbers. My voice is going and that to me is really depressing. So it would be transformative in a purely electoral sense, as well as, I think, a very personal sense for millions of young people in this country. Right, next before I die. I promise not to splutter all over you.
What's going on?
Yeah, sorry. This might be a bit of a controversial question, but I've been reading, I don't know if anyone has, I've seen a lot of really disturbing headlines, and I've actually read quite a couple of disturbing articles, just literally full of people doing the most abhorrent crimes. My question to you is, do you think the death penalty is an offensive form of punishment?
That is a good question. What was the word you used, the adjective? Effective? Well, it certainly would be effective in the literal sense. But I am someone who has had my fair share of run-ins, I don't know if anyone knows this, with the judiciary and with the police, in fact. I had a 4-year legal challenge against an arm of the state, the Electoral Commission, a regulator of elections. I went to court over that. I was investigated by the Metropolitan Police over that, and I hadn't done anything wrong. Now, I won that court case and got through that, and I was also interviewed by the police, well, almost interviewed, it didn't actually go ahead in the end, but I was under investigation at least by the police for the views a guest had, for the speech a guest had used on my show, on my YouTube show. And they are two examples, I think, at least, you might disagree, but of injustice as far as the use of the police is concerned, an abuse of police resources and time. Now, had that gone against me, I'm not suggesting that for electoral offences, you would suggest we have the death penalty there. But had that gone against me, there would have been absolutely nothing I could do about it. The reason I mention those 2 points is that I am concerned about the fact that sometimes people get things wrong, and I don't mean the individual who's committed the crime. I mean that the police and all the rest of it, increasingly, as far as DNA is concerned and all these other things, that's happening less and less. But there are still cases where it could happen, and as a Christian, frankly, I think that taking a life when you could have made an absolutely, it doesn't bear thinking about, colossal mistake would be too big a cross to bear, frankly. So, no, I don't support the death penalty. It was a very long-winded way of answering your question, but I hope that answers it. Right, any other question? It can be as controversial as that one if you want.
I don't understand why so many people would so freely want to give up our sovereignty and free speech and so on, but clearly a lot are, especially in the younger generation. During the time of the issue with Brexit, the actor Michael Caine said that he would rather be a poor master than a rich slave. And I felt he hit the nail on the head quite well there. But clearly something is motivating a lot of people to take a different position. Do you have a sense of what the drivers are? Is it just a well-coordinated social media campaign? Is it big tech leading it? Where's the driver coming from?
Thank you. I actually think that if you look throughout history, people have valued security over freedom. It's a natural human response to actually say, well, I guess it's why the Soviet Union and all these other things survived for so long, but until they became incompatible with, I guess, human reality, I don't think it's possible to live without the human instinct of being able to provide for your family and all the rest of it without actually needing to go through goodness only knows how much rigmarole of the state. But I think it comes down to that fundamental point that people that proponents of freedom are always going to be on the back foot. They're always going to be the unpopular one in the room, because to be safe and secure is, as I say, a natural human instinct. Dennis Prager put this incredibly well in an interview I did with him last year as far as coronavirus is concerned, where I asked him the question rather, which is, why do you think so many people disagree with you that lockdowns are proportionate? I think some form of response to the coronavirus was necessary. I do. Do I think that locking the country down 3 times and causing the crisis that we're seeing right now as far as healthcare, mental health, and so many other things are concerned? I mean, there were, until not too long ago, 2 weeks ago maybe, 1 million people still on furlough, and if you're still on furlough at that point, folks, it means your job doesn't exist anymore. So there are so many ways in which I think perhaps charitably you could argue that people didn't know the full extent to that, but I actually would argue that people did know there would be a massive trade-off, and that people decided that security was more important. So I don't think it's down to big tech and all of these other things, because actually many people in Silicon Valley would actually argue that they are libertarian, right? They would argue that they are flag-waving, card-carrying members of the pro-freedom lobby. That's bollocks, frankly, but they would argue that. And then it comes down, it goes back to that point. People will always value security over freedom, and you just have to make the better arguments. And I'm afraid to say that we're not at the moment. We're just accepting, I think, frankly, anti-freedom arguments on everything from house building to speech to truth and debate. I go back to that point about Boris Johnson being unable to answer the question of who does and does not own a cervix. I mean, to many people, that question might seem, well, why is it important that the Prime Minister answers that question? And it's important because I think that once the definition of who is and isn't a woman is concerned, one, you lose the language, you lose the tools that we've used to communicate with each other for goodness only knows how long, but you also lose really important key tenets of any, I think, society that champions the protections of women and others. As far as access to single-sex spaces is concerned, I come from a part of the world where there are far too many people, shall we say, who have experienced some pretty nasty relationships and domestic violence. And the idea that, say next week, I say, well, I want to be known as Doreen, folks. The idea that I could walk into a women's refuge and say, well, that act of self-identification is enough for me to access this space is deeply troubling for me. So, freedom is in peril, as I say. I said that earlier, but it takes people to actually stand up and be counted for, and hopefully people in this room will be willing to do that. but I don't think it's down to big tech. I think they certainly play a part in propagating certain, for example, controversially, but I definitely think that they helped elect President Biden because orange man bad, man with dementia good. And I'm not convinced that that was a sensible idea for, one, the protection of liberty and freedom around the world, because of course America is the leader of the free world. But now they're seeing the fruits of that, right? They're seeing this man who cannot string together a sentence. He's probably doing a better job than I am, but there we are. Right. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, so I just want to ask about sort of cultural issues, especially when we're talking about with joining Liberal Democrats and supporting gay marriage and things like that.
Yeah.
It's this sort of cultural liberalism that has increasingly encroached into our society and reached the point where we're now talking about transgenderism and these big issues that politicians are afraid to comment on. Where do you think this will end? Do you think there's anything we can do to stop this sort of regressive encroach on our society in that way?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I mean, this all goes back, as I mentioned, that this is all the postmodernism's textbook stuff where you first goes the language, because, you know, when sex doesn't exist, then gender and all these other things become king, self-identification, what you say you are, truth isn't an actual reality, right? It starts to get, I feel like I'm living through a sort of really bad rerun of The Matrix, you know, where you're living in some really dodgy reality. I certainly do think liberalism in the small L sense, but in the the Adam Smith tradition, right? The sort of French Enlightenment and all of these other really important movements. I mean, if you consider the fact that Scotland used to be a beacon of freedom and liberty, in the sense of they championed the liberalism around the globe, and now you look at them and they've got that tin pot dictator, Nicky Sturgeon, who I think, as far as the named person scheme is concerned, where, you know, you have to, everyone has a named person. Every child, has a named person. And so many authoritarian liberal, I mean, Scotland basically said, COVID passports, they sound sufficiently draconian, let's go for it. And we're one of the first countries to say they would go ahead and do them. Wales has also done it, unfortunately. But liberalism, people have forgotten what that actually means. You know, I guess that comes down to the fact that America have taken the word and ran with it in a very different direction to the one that I think it was originally intended. But those core values, I wouldn't self-describe myself as a liberal, I would self-describe myself as a conservative, but I would say that my conservatism is in the same tradition as Margaret Thatcher's, in the sense of it is there to conserve and protect English freedoms and liberties. And I think those freedoms and liberties are no clearer articulated than, well, you could even look at the American Constitution, right? There are so many parts throughout our history that have stemmed from that moment. I think liberalism has gone horribly wrong. I think liberalism has been bastardized, frankly, and corrupted. But if you go back to those key tenets of protecting everything like freedom of expression, which the Liberal Democrats won't. Honestly, I think that the Advertising Standards Agency, frankly, should get in touch with the Liberal Democrats and tell them that they're selling people a pup, because they really are. They've forgotten that rich tradition. The Liberal Party, right, was responsible for the emancipation of people. Like, I wouldn't have had the vote had it not been for the Liberal Party. And they've forgotten that rich tradition. And the idea that it's liberal, they're compatible with liberalism, for example, to turn around to 17.4 million people and say, well, frankly, pet, you got it wrong, vote again until you give us a result that we actually like. That's complete and utter nonsense. Liberalism is in peril, but I mean liberalism in the sense of the original definition of it, right? Liberalism that my grandfather and his... I always go back to when people say to me, which many students tend to do, how can we be braver when we're so worried that we'll be marked down in class or in our grades for articulating conservative viewpoints or traditionally liberal viewpoints? And I always give them the story of my grandfather, actually, who served in Korea from 50 to 52. And he would tell us stories about, he then served in the, worked in the mines, but this was during his national service, and he was unlucky enough to have to go to Korea. But he was proud as punch of the fact that he did. He said he wouldn't change it for the world. And I thought, what? You wouldn't change going to war, the other side of the world, for the world, really? And he felt immense pride of what his country had actually done there, of what his flag represented. And I think it was those liberal values, democracy, and all the rest of it. And he would tell us stories about people that, because it was so brutal during the winter, the frostbite was at such an extent that, you know, people would be unable to move their fingers to the extent where you've got bits of your body just coming off. The howls of people on the terraced blocks that the miners used to live in. The miners would be given these houses as a, you know, I was going to say thanks, as you need somewhere a roof to put over your head as you work down perilous hours down these mines, dangerous mines. And there would be howls on these streets when my granddad arrived back for the kids that didn't come back with him. I mean, he was born in 1930, so, you know, very young man at that point. And I think back to that and I think, you're telling me you're worried about the grades? Really? And that sort of puts it into perspective for me. That people can be brave, people can remember what the flag used to represent to people like that. Look at South Korea now, right? He could point to a very tangible benefit of what Britain represents around the world. So, the culture arguments and all of these other things, they sound like we shouldn't care about them, they sound petty and juvenile and that we shouldn't give a damn about these things. But I really think we should, because for the very reason that I've just set out, I'm so concerned that we're forgetting the core tenets of what people like my grandfather believed. And I'm doing a Theresa May again, sorry. But hopefully that answers your question.
Well, it's not exactly something you said you disagree with, it's more of a...
Yeah, I'm being told off.
It's more of a question I was going to ask. So, my main question was, the northeast of England, which is the region where both of you, me and you are from, is the poorest region in the UK, Newcastle. Is the poorest region in the UK with countries such as Redcar, Hartlepool, economically left in the dark. And I would just like to know, to what extent do you believe capitalism is at fault for that, and in what way would you counteract in the future this inequality carrying on, basically?
Yeah. You know what, I don't think it won't surprise you to learn that I don't think capitalism is responsible for that. I think capitalism is responsible for the fact that I'm not down in mine like my granddad was. I mean, my grandfather had been down there for such a long time that he could no longer fully extend his arm, right, by the time I was born. And to me, capitalism is the reason that, one, there is affordability of all of these other things that my generation got to enjoy as someone from the northeast at school. It is fundamentally capitalist, I think, for someone to be able to buy their own home. That's why I've gone back to that quite a lot. Passionate about that particular topic. But the way in which I think you combat that, I think the Tees Valley Mayor, like Ben Houchin, is doing a really good job. I think the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia might actually be about to do something for us. But I think the way in which you challenge regional inequalities is through a fundamentally capitalist idea, which is to devolve things like corporation tax we are one of the most heavily centralised economies, apart from, say, France, which is very, very centralised. We are, as far as the OECD is concerned, we are OECD is concerned. OECD is something entirely different. We are a very heavily centralised country. I think that the solution lies in decentralisation. It lies in saying, people like Ben Houchen being able to say, well, I want corporation tax to be 10% here in the North East. And then Northern Ireland, I was about to say Arlene Foster, it's Jeffrey Donaldson now, can turn around and say, well, I would quite like corporation tax to be 8% here, and create a sort of a race to open businesses and start tech hubs and all the rest of it in areas like that. Dare I say, you can even have some of the green crap if you want, if you must. And that's how I think you solve regional inequalities. And I think that is slowly but surely people are waking up to that idea. People are realising that that's how we do it. I think probably the one area where perhaps I would be a little bit sceptical of what Mrs. T did is that I don't think I was born in Consett, which used to have a big steelworks, and that was closed down. It was uncompetitive and all the rest of it. But I think to say to lads like that, who worked in places like that, who had pride over their jobs and therefore their lives, and the impact that losing said industries had on communities like that. I mean, my mother, for example, not even around when, she was, but she was far too young to be able to vote and take part in democratic elections. She absolutely despises Margaret Thatcher. There's still this romanticism of the halcyon days of when we did have steelworks and all these other things. I think it was a mistake to just say to people, well, that's it, right? You've lost that, go on welfare. Because that creates dependency. And I think that was a mistake. I really, really do. There were some programmes and all the rest of it, but it was a mistake to do that. That's now starting to be corrected. I think Ben Houchen is an absolutely amazing bloke. I might disagree with him vehemently on the idea that the North East can become a sort of global, international superpower by building great big windmills, is the way to go. But there are so many industries that we could attract to regions like that, and as you might know, I am very, very passionate about ensuring that North East is a beneficiary of Brexit, frankly, and that's how you do it. So hopefully politicians and Rishi Sunak won't try and keep the power as close to him as possible. I believe in devolving power as close to the individual as possible, and I think that's a really sensible way of doing it, if that answers your question. Right, any others? Yeah? You have to come to that, sorry. You have to get onto my spotlight. DJ Grimes on the mix in a minute, isn't it?
I've just picked up on what you comment about the getting powers close to the individual. And just to say, I just started a master's here, and I had my first seminar with my one unit yesterday, and the other today. My seminar student today said that he's a self-proclaimed Marxist, and he's going to be teaching us through the lens of historical materialism. And the one yesterday said neoliberalism is bad, and that it's there to stop people getting a collective identity. Just what's going on in our universities?
Yeah, good question. The problem with universities, that sort of clockwork effect that I mentioned, where people like dare I say Darren Grimes are too controversial to speak to universities, where it was only this was only accepted yesterday, right? If you put the application in 3 months ago, there is a real crisis of I guess the permanently offended finding themselves in positions of power. That's why, it's refreshing to hear from people like yourselves, and hopefully you decide to get involved, because unless you do, frankly, it's a case of being up shit creek without a paddle, right? Because there will be no avenues for challenging that bloke. But what I will say, I've had my fair share of being put onto especially BBC panels where it's a case of being sometimes 3 against 1. I'll never forget one of the first big debates I did was a Channel 4 News one, And Jon Snow got down on a sort of bended knee and said, "Darren, what do you think?" And I thought, why are you taking the knee like that? It was the most patronising thing I'd ever seen. And it was because he sort of, I think he felt like that because he realised that the panel was so skewed away from this young, terrified 22-year-old who was trying to articulate a case for Brexit. But there is something to be said about your view being the one that stands out the most. I wouldn't feel despondent about the fact that you're being taught by someone to the left of bloody Chairman Mao. Because I think it's an opportunity. I think it's an opportunity for you to actually, one, see the other side of the argument. I'm guessing your position is the opposite to his, yes? It gives you the chance to actually hone in on what you... The fact why I'm so passionate about speech and debate is because it's been the tools in which, without resorting to violence, we have reached conclusions and truth from said debate. You two, I'd love to get you in a room and speak to you about why you view things the way you do and why he views things the way he does. I think it's an opportunity for you to actually, like I did on that panel, I stood out on that panel actually. Sarah Morrison, who was vice chair of the Conservative Party under Ted Heath, she had some very fine words to say. She said I was uneducated and didn't know what I was talking about. But I stood out from that debate. It went viral and all these other things. And I learned a lot from that debate, and I'm very grateful that I did it. I think at the end of your masters, you'll be grateful for the fact that you have been taught by someone that preaches from the sort of the creed of Marxism. It's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. But why it's happening, I mean, because the Conservative Party has been sat on its arse for the past, it's been in power for over a decade, but as far as the long march through the institutions is concerned, hasn't done much. It has not done much at all. I mean, you're starting to see some pushback in certain ways, but it's not to the same extent that I think even in the United States of America, this is very evident. And groups like Turning Point, you might disagree with some things, you might agree with passionately with others. But it's really important that people are given both sides of the argument. And that's what a Conservative Party with an 80-seat majority should be doing. So I agree with you that there's a problem, a very clear problem. But you should take it as an opportunity. That can be my advice to you. Take it as an opportunity. Being the odd one out, the sort of black sheep. I'm not sure you're not allowed to say that anymore. I think you've got to say rainbow sheep. Can be an opportunity for you. So don't be despondent, basically. Right, anything else? I like that jumper, by the way.
I was just wondering what your thoughts on Boris Johnson are.
So you should watch the clip that I put out today, actually, for a reason, where you're in it. I was asking the question, a very simple question, at least what I thought was a very simple question, where I said, what does Boris Johnson stand for? And the responses that I was getting, a lot of people can't answer the question. And I think Boris Johnson has to be one of the luckiest people in the world. Imagine your luck if you consider the fact that in London, what he had to face off was Ken Livingstone. Sort of anti-Semite and crank. Although admittedly he wasn't as completely mad and bad as he is today. And then Theresa May, and then Jeremy Corbyn. And now he's got Sir Keir Starmer, who is so robotic, against someone whose oratory is compared to Churchill, against someone who is a sort of titan of Brexit, which was the view of the majority, right? He has been really, really lucky. But now it's getting to the point where, you know, you've got a fuel crisis, you've got an energy crisis, the F crisis, where you've got, well, the FFS crisis, I guess you could say, fuel, food, and energy. And the fact of the matter is that as far as Boris is concerned, he's now been asked to actually, there are people like, you know, that my mother and others like her up and down the country who are really going to struggle this winter. And the way in which I'd answer the question of how I feel about Boris Johnson would be that I actually view it as pretty contemptible that he, in response to being asked the question, I'm going to start to sound like a socialist now, but being asked the question of, do you recognise how difficult it's going to be? And he said, wages are going up. Wages are going up. Now that is true, wages are going up in certain sectors and all the rest of it, but for many people it would be a real terms pay cut in the sense of food inflation, energy inflation. There will be a real cost of living crisis. I think the reason I'm sceptical about the rush for net zero is that reason that energy bills and all the rest of it will be higher. I used to, my mother went through a pretty nasty divorce when I was a teenager. I used to switch my mother's energy bills to find the best provider because I recognised that it was, if she had the best energy bills possible, that's more money for the household. A very weird thing for a teenager to do, but I did it nonetheless. And Boris doesn't get that. Boris doesn't get that, how hard it will be. And I find that really depressing. Margaret Thatcher would have got that. Margaret Thatcher lived above a shop, right? She, famously. And I am starting to actually say that I was a little bit naive to back Boris Johnson as much as I did, actually. That sort of, the promise of Brexit, that optimism, Panglossian optimism, you could actually argue, where the man talks a good game, I'll give him that. But when it comes to actually delivering and putting things in practice, I'm not convinced. So there. Right, any other?
I just wanted to ask your opinions on non-binary people in particular. Do you think it's a valid way to identify?
Thank you very much for that question. I actually got myself into hot water over this issue because I was asked about it. Well, actually, I wasn't asked about it. I just decided that people needed to know my view on it. So it was when, I don't know if you remember, but the pop star Demi Lovato, she came out as being non-binary, and before that she'd come out, I think, as being bisexual, and before that she'd come out as being like pansexual or whatever it is, the woke watchword of the moment. And whatever she had said, she
just came out as bisexual.
Bisexual.
Yeah, that was it.
It must have been Miley Cyrus that came out as pansexual. Anyway, it was one of the things. And I did a video on this for my YouTube channel, in which I said, you know, this was a case of, oh, please look at me, I'm not selling enough albums and singles. I think, frankly, and there's a Lib Dem MP called Leila Moran who has sort of championed this issue in Oxford. And I'm not convinced that it's anything other than a cry for attention. I really am not. Call yourself whatever you want. I will respect your right to do that, and I will, at your request, I'm not suggesting that you do want me to call you anything or call you they, them. My pronouns, by the way, are His Royal Highness. But as I say, I'm not convinced that it's nothing other than a desperate cry for attention. And Demi Lovato was just seeking that, and she got it, to be fair to her, so good for you, girl. But the politicians pushing this stuff, again, putting they, them in your bio, your Twitter bio, doesn't make your tweets more interesting, it doesn't make you more interesting. In fact, you're a bit boring, right? You are not liberal, you are not democratic, you stand for nothing, you fall for everything. And I am not convinced that this isn't just the moves of petulant prats, to be quite honest. Not that I've been anything other than that until now. Yeah, that's my view on non-binary. Again, I'll call you whatever you want, by whatever pronouns you want us to call you. And if I forget to do that, I'll probably be cancelled and all the rest of it. But such is life. So you jumper.
What would you say to people who might levy those same accusations, that people who are homosexual or minority sexualities?
Who does that though?
Amazing.
In the past, in a decade, not so long ago, many people say, oh, they're not really.
Yeah, well, I mean, what I would say to that is, I think it's pretty clear that I am a homosexual if I was to stick my tongue down the throat, right? There's a sort of very, I think, obvious, the way in which I live my life. There is a very obvious, I'm not sure it's the same thing at all, actually. One, because I vehemently disagree with the idea that the trans debate, I would separate LGBT from the LGB. Because I don't believe that sex and sexuality, me saying I fancy blokes is not the same thing as someone saying, well, I want to go on puberty blockers and hormone treatments, and all of these other things, or I want you to start calling me they, them. I don't think they're the same thing at all. So I would actually argue, first of all, with that. And secondly, as far as the trans debate in and of itself is concerned, I do not have a problem, contrary to popular belief, with any trans person whatsoever. Again, like I say, I will call you whatever you want me to. I don't think trans people are desperate for attention. In fact, I think the vast majority of trans people just want to be left alone, and that's why they absolutely hate this whole debate. And it's a vocal minority of people who are ruining what we have built up since the 2004 Gender Recognition Act, and before, where we have built up an acceptance and a tolerance in society. I think trans people are accepted in society as far as in law and wider society is concerned. That's a good thing in my opinion, and long may it continue. But I think people like Demi Lovato risk actually making life difficult for people that are genuinely trans, who are genuinely struggling, who are genuinely of the belief that they experience gender dysphoria, who go through the process of the checks and balances that you have to go through before making a life-altering decision like that. And my heart goes out to those people, it really, really does. But I think it's deeply irresponsible for these people who all of a sudden have gone for you can't argue that there was a sudden rush for homosexuality, right? I think there's a pretty long and defined history of people being same-sex attracted. I'm not sure there's a long and rich tradition of people deciding all of a sudden that they are they, them, and taking umbrage with society's definition of sex and gender, and wanting to fundamentally alter those things, and actually telling women that they don't have a right to, their sex-based rights. So I don't think the two things are the same at all. You can come back to that if you want, though.
Maybe chat afterwards.
Okay. Yeah? Can I ask there's one question there? This is it, I promise.
Yeah, I'll make it quick.
I'm desperate for a drink.
You said that regarding Demi Lovato, this whole thing is a bit attention-seeking. What about your sort of Marcus Rashford tweet straight after his penalties? Wasn't that a little bit sort of attention-seeking?
Touché. There aren't many things in life that I would say I regret. But being pissed and tweeting about Marcus Rashford is probably one of them. I think it was uncharitable, shall we say. But I don't think I was going out of my way to cause a media firestorm, right? I wasn't expecting to wake up the next day to the media bids to ask us why I hate Marcus Rashford, which I don't. I do disagree with his, the idea that politicians, democratically elected politicians, should be listening wholeheartedly to the views of a footballer. I take umbrage with that ever so slightly. Do I think that the way in which Marcus conducted himself during that penalty, where he did that daft, why do they do that daft little, thing on the spot? What are you doing? Just kick the ball, man! So I sort of, it was uncharitable. I think it was the wrong thing to say, and I probably do regret it. But I don't think I was fishing for attention. But yes, you can say that, I guess. You could argue that. You could say it. But it's not the same thing, right? I haven't announced to the world that I am Marcus Rashford skeptic, right? I haven't released a podcast or a video or an interview with a magazine declaring that the world be interested in the fact that I now self-declare as a Marcus Rashford skeptic. Yeah, that's what I'd say to that, I guess. Now, piss off and get a drink, will you? Yes, thank you very much for listening to me prattle on, and I'm really sorry about my voice.
I just want to say that was incredible. I think today it's very useful to have honest and truthful opinions being said in any context. I really appreciate you being honest, taking the time to bring about a more discussion. And it's really appreciated. Thank you for coming to Bristol, the heart of socialism, I'd say anyway. So it's really, I'm very grateful for you coming. I'm very grateful for everybody to come to the event as well. Thank you for all your questions. It's been so amazing to hear from every one of you who has a question. It's very brave of you as well to say a question, especially given our climate. So one more round of applause for Darren and the